A simple guide to CEDAW and the SDGs. Here's a very simple guide to how CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, can work together to advance gender equality. Let's start with the concept of gender equality. Gender equality must be integrated, interlinked, and indivisible in both the human rights framework and the sustainable development framework. A framework includes everything needed to deliver a goal. For example, the human rights framework is not just the declarations and treaties that make up human rights law, it is also the mechanisms for review and independent experts that ensure human rights. When the human rights framework and the sustainable development framework work together or harmonise, they create policy coherence and accountability to gender equality. Or, as Professor Savitri, former CEDAW committee member, said, "You ratify, you harmonise." In the Sustainable Development Framework, Target 17.4 calls for enhanced policy coherence for sustainable development. This simple guide is our contribution to this target. In doing so, we may be able to shift potential SDGs rhetoric into rights realisation. We will now show you how to harmonise these frameworks in order to achieve gender equality by 2030. CEDAW describes human rights for all women. Here, gender equality is understood as substantive equality. Substantive equality means that equality is not only found in laws and policies, but it is also a lived experience and there is equality in practice. Governments that have ratified CEDAW but apply a lesser standard than substantive equality in the SDGs will not meet their state obligations under CEDAW. No framework can confer, alter, or amend existing human rights. The SDGs are merely goals, not rights, but as global goals, they recognise the interlinkages between social inclusion, economic inclusion, and environmental protection. On the one hand, the SDGs provide CEDAW with a new framework to monitor progress on gender equality, and on the other hand, CEDAW offers the SDGs a credible review process to hold governments accountable to the promises they made. The CEDAW review process allows civil society to submit a report known as a shadow report on women's human rights in any country that has ratified the treaty. In this way, the SDGs and CEDAW can be mutually reinforcing for the benefit of all women. Each of these frameworks provides a different lens in which to implement gender equality. The most focused and targeted lens for implementing gender equality is the Women's Rights Framework. This lens includes principles such as substantive equality and non-discrimination and has a review mechanism through CEDAW. A broader lens is the Human Rights Framework. This lens includes principles such as due diligence and non-retrogression and has mechanisms such as the Universal Periodic Review. The Sustainable Development Framework has an even wider lens, as it not only includes principles of social and economic inclusion, but also environmental protection. As you can see, all three lenses are capable of harmonising and implementing gender equality, but the Women's Rights Framework is the most adapted. Within gender equality, there are intersectional issues, such as violence against women, Indigenous women that are marginalised, land grabs, forced migration, and lack of freedom of expression. All these are barriers to women achieving gender equality and are not experienced in isolation. Many women worldwide experience violation. Within this experience of violence, marginalised women, for example some Indigenous women, can be particularly affected. This leads to greater exploitation of these women in other aspects of their life, such as through land grabs. Land grabs force women to migrate. As migrants, women are often denied their human rights, including their right to freedom of expression, which denies them the right to speak out about human rights violations. In the SDGs, there are targets to assist governments to accelerate progress towards gender equality. However, not all targets support the realisation of women's human rights according to CEDAW. Next, we will show you some of the gaps between CEDAW and the SDGs in relation to three of the issues we have raised, that being violence against women, Indigenous women who are marginalised, and land grabs. CEDAW makes recommendations to all governments on issues they believe need particular attention. There are currently 34 general recommendations, including on violence against women, but the most relevant articles in CEDAW are Article 12.1 on health, Article 15.2 on access to justice, and Article 16.1 on rights related to marriage. The SDGs do specifically mention violence against women. Target 5.2 calls for the reduction of violence everywhere. In addition to this target, there are a number of other targets that indirectly reinforce the elimination of violence against women. Healthcare is crucial for women experiencing violence, but there is a big difference between healthcare found in Article 12.1 of CEDAW and health coverage found in Target 3.8 of the SDGs. Coverage relates to insurance. Insurance can be both public and private, but the target only refers to quality essential healthcare services and does not mention affordable or non-essential services. This means the target will fall short of attaining the pre-existing state obligations found in Article 12.1 of CEDAW. Article 16.1 relates to the rights in respect to marriage and correlates with Target 5.3 in the SDGs. However, here there is a substantial gap between the two. Although Target 5.3 stipulates the elimination of all harmful practices, it does not explicitly state women's rights to be free from marital rape, forced engagement, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, forced motherhood, forced adoption, and other rights covered explicitly in CEDAW. This means that Target 5.3 does not meet the state obligations in CEDAW. Governments who have ratified CEDAW but only meet this target will not be fulfilling their legal obligations under the treaty. Now to consider Indigenous women who are marginalised. In this context, we note that the SDGs notion of social inclusion, articulated in the phrase "leave no one behind," can lead to women being included in exploitative structures and therefore will entrench inequalities. Inclusion is not the same as equality. Unlike the SDGs, CEDAW challenges inequalities in structures. In fact, evidence proves that being included in the current economic model increases inequalities. In the case of Indigenous women who are marginalised, we can analyse whether the SDGs are CEDAW compliant by viewing the targets in light of Article 4.1 of CEDAW on temporary special measures. There are approximately 7 targets relevant to Indigenous women in the SDGs. Whilst the SDGs provides a number of temporary special measures related to Indigenous women, none meet the existing thresholds set out in CEDAW. Many are about participation and not about Indigenous women's rights. For example, 6B on water and sanitation is about strengthening participation and is not about the right to natural resources. 11.4 talks about cultural heritage rather than cultural rights. 15.6 is about equity, not equality, and the subjective phrasing of appropriate access rather than the objective phrasing of a right to access may confuse states as to what their obligations are. The greatest omission in respect to Indigenous women in the SDGs is the exclusion of equal land rights, which brings us to our next issue, land grabs. Women's right to land continues to be subject to traditional, cultural and patriarchal practices that discriminate against women. We will review 3 articles in CEDAW: Article 2E on eliminating discrimination, Article 13 on economic rights, and Article 14 on rural women. Article 2E states enterprises cannot discriminate against women. If we compare this target to 2.3, a number of issues surface. Firstly, doubling the productivity of women farmers does not ensure their human, labour and land rights. Secondly, equal access to land is not the same as equal land rights. In addition, 14.1, which articulates the rights of rural women, is not explicitly mentioned in the SDGs related to land rights. Therefore, achieving the SDG targets will not simultaneously achieve existing state obligations under CEDAW. So we have described some gaps between CEDAW and the SDGs in 3 areas: violence against women, Indigenous women who are marginalised, and land grabs. Now that you can see some of the gaps, what do you do with this information, especially if consultation on indicators is complete? When you write your next shadow report to CEDAW, we encourage all civil society to write a sentence such as, "The SDGs targets do not meet the existing state obligations under CEDAW. We recommend the state revise the SDGs indicators at the national level to avoid non-compliance with CEDAW." If we get everyone reporting to CEDAW on the SDGs, we will not only reinforce human rights mechanisms as primary in achieving gender equality, but over the next 3 years we can create a strong evidence base and critical mass that could justify an evolution of the SDGs indicators, which would advance women's human rights. Please let us know if you are interested in joining such a campaign, and let us know if you will include the SDGs in your next shadow report to CEDAW.